Okay, my name is Judy Adams, and I'm here at the Palestine Public Library, and this is brought about through the Heath Foundation. And today I'm interviewing Jack Morris. Today is April 7th, 2014. Thank you, Jack, for agreeing to this interview. The purpose is to gather personal histories of the people who lived in Crawford County, Illinois most of their lives and have helped shape it. As this project is due to the funding of a grant from the Mary Heath Foundation, we are especially interested in the history of the Heath family. So I'll start out by asking you your full name.
John R. Morris, Jr.
And what were your parents' names?
John R. Morris, Sr. and Mary Catherine Heath.
And did you have any siblings?
One.
And what was your sibling's name?
Robert R. Morris, brother.
So your parents were always from this area?
No, my dad was from Minneapolis, Minnesota, although he was originally born in Nebraska.
Okay. Were you born in Robinson?
Yes.
What was it like growing up in the Heath family?
Not pleasurable.
Okay. We'll let you tell a story about that later. So where did you go to school?
Robinson High School, Robinson Grade School. Before that, I lived in New York City, but I think that was preschool.
Okay. Then did you go on to college?
Yes. University of Kentucky, University of Louisville.
Okay. Did you have any teachers that impacted you?
In high school,
In
college,
any
what's in a long time? A history professor at the University of Kentucky named Wall was a interesting individual. I can't really pinpoint anyone. Maybe Linda, what was named Linda Murphy, who was Linda St. Clair in high school. And if you probably remember, she taught typing.
Yes.
In that case, since you and I went to high school at the same time.
Yes.
Whatever I say, you would know anyway.
Uh-huh.
I was not influenced by Wilma Nuttall, though, however.
Okay.
As many people say.
I never had her as a teacher, so I can't say.
Well,
Did you have any memorable moments from school?
Depending on what you call memorable moments. Sports, of course, was interesting to me. We were at the beginning of the rock and roll era, of course, which was substantial, more substantial than certainly any of us realized.
Mm-hmm.
I guess we were the last years of the silent generation, which the word was be seen and not heard, those sort of things, and that, of course, was still there. But other than that, I can't really pin things down that were that I'll always remember. No, I don't. It did not have the impact on me that maybe it should have, but it did not.
Did you think it was a good time to grow up in a small community?
I was from a dysfunctional family, which it painted things differently than what reality was. An alcoholic family for the most part. And at that point, your view of life is totally different than what it would be and what at that time was considered functional people. They were just dysfunctional individuals for many, many reasons, but they didn't, in fact, belong to each other. They just weren't the right kind of people to be together. Oddly enough, I think my dad married for money, and I think that haunted him forever. And I think when you're in that environment, that's not a good environment to be in.
I see. So what are your thoughts for the future of Crawford County?
As long as there's oil, it's going to be here. If there's no oil, Crawford County won't exist.
What are some of the things that life has taught you?
How short it is.
Did you have any children?
No, I did not.
Do you have any words of wisdom that you can give to the younger generation as they are starting their careers?
Well, I guess if the one thing I would say is nothing top-down works. If you look at nothing works top-down. Everything works bottom-up. So if I would give anybody, start to think about bottom-up rather than top-down, including government and everything else. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the advice I'd give. Look
That's good.
bottom-up.
Okay, so now this is the big question, I guess. What are your memories of the history of your family and the Heath plant, which is now the Hershey plant?
Well, it's complicated in a sense, only because the fact that there are so many characters that are involved in it. It certainly was a family dominated early on by an old man who was an entrepreneur, who had the desire to keep all of his family together all the time. And he would go to any length to do that. Mr. Heath, or L.S. Heath, was not the Heath Bar. He certainly was the entrepreneur behind all of it. I think the significant thing about that was that when L.S. Heath bet the entire company and everything on oil well, that William Bell had told him about, and they hit it. They hit, I think it was 5,000 barrels a day. So there was money. It was oil money. So all of the way that the company and its influence early on was oil money. They were not making money in candy bars and stuff like that. It was a small operation. Mr. Heath had a dairy. He had farm ground, oil then in the 30s. So it was and he had total control because he had control of the pocketbook. And he was able to corral his family one way or the other and keep them close. That's what his whole desire was, and would go to any length to do such. So he was a guy that certainly took credit for the Heath Bar on his deathbed, which infuriated, I think, some of his kids, especially I think Byron Heath Sr. was definitely unhappy about that. Of course, Byron Heath Sr. wasn't president of the company until he was 65 years old. So Mr. Heath stayed there until he was dead. And so, I mean, I think you have that. And he pitted his kids against each other, which created an environment where the trust was not there. And, you know, many talk about the fights the Heath family, but that's where it started. The old man had the desire to keep his family from trusting each other. So therefore, water was thicker than blood. And this is what created the uncertainties that unfortunately are still here today in some families. And that's 100 and some odd years. So that's the Heath family in a nutshell. Now there are a lot of other things that are into that and which get to be far, far more interesting, but that's what he was. And so-called he was the banker, if you want to put it in another term. And he kept everybody there. I mean, there's just no question about it.
So he was the one in charge, and he was the one that laid down the law.
He's the one that had the money. And once that happened, and then all the enterprises, of which he cut everybody in. I mean, there was no question. Everybody got, but their salaries were from the oil company early on. They did not, the rest of the enterprises did not have and there weren't monstrous salaries at all at that point in time. It just was a set of circumstances that he made sure he picked the tab up, he paid the insurance, he bought the homes, he did the things that all, and that included everyone. It wasn't just one family group or another, but he's the one that picked the tab up. So therefore, they were all beholden to him in one way or the other. And he structured it that way. I mean, that was a deliberate act. I think if you read Mr. Heath's book, you can see it's just an act of hubris more than anything else. And he thought he was wonderful. And that's when and that tells you about someone. I mean, if he'd been significant, I think worldwide, that might have been the story. But if you read his book, it basically doesn't tell quite the true story. It's his view of him and what he was. So that mentality, he was known to have run his boys off at what they called the plant back then, and they were in their 50s. He didn't have to send them home. And that's Everett and Byron sent them home. So it's, and a girlfriend, of course, other than his wife. So it's all of those same stories that we read about in history books with other people that either are powerful or perceive themselves to be.
So did it start out as a dairy company and then working?
No, Mr. Heath was an entrepreneur. And when I refer to that, mainly he was or LS, or Father Heath, as some people called him, or Granddad, as I called him. Okay. He was into many things. An entrepreneur, that means he never thought about putting all his eggs in one basket. Whether he funded his 2 sons in the confectionery, or whether it was the farms, or whether they got into later Pepsi-Cola, or they got into different things. He was always into something different. But the oil was the key thing, as always Crawford County. The Heath is as much oil as it is, and William Bell, who was Bell Brothers. That's where that came from. So he was a guy that had interests that were very diverse as far as business interests were concerned. I guess he was a school teacher at one time, a mayor at one time, apparently, and but he was not what we would call a professional business person. That means a professional manager. That was not his skill. His skill was coming up with this and making money at different things, which he did do. There's no question about that. And when he bet the whole farm, bet everything on an oil well, I think that demonstrates, what really he was. And certainly that carried over with some of his offspring. So that is Heath. Heath is oil. It was candy, but it just wasn't there. It became candy much, much later, or it became a flavor much, much later than most people perceive it to be. The dairy he forced them to move into the dairy. The dairy never made any money, just lost money right and left. And when he died, they sold. I mean, that was just how. So that's the way he operated. And he put all his money in the dairy and didn't put much money in the candy operation. So it was really a competition, in a sense, with his sons, 2 oldest ones. The 2 younger ones, not so much so. But and the girls were on the sidelines. So
the girls did not take an active part then?
Not really. Ruby did some work early on. Mary was the baby, although no one's quite sure whether Ruby was Mary's mother. There is some argument about that, and that's been before. So that's one of the things that never was quite straightened out. There was always that possibility, and it was the relationships between those 2 that really were more significant than just sisters. So that may have been the case. I don't know. I mean, we almost found out once, but it turned out that we just didn't. And that's after Mary had died and Ruby had died. When that came to pass, we might had to find out whether they were mother and daughter or some rather than sisters. So that was part of the world.
I see. Well, there's always things in every family that come up.
Oh yeah, it's not atypical with any family. You can find them all over the place. They just don't like to talk about it.
Right.
And I think that what's most important is you do talk about it. Because if you don't, then you harbor a story. Then you have to make that up later on, and it always gets screwed up some way or the other. So no, they are no different than a lot of families, especially when there's some money tossed around. And it wasn't huge money relative to what we think today, but it was the oil company, and the oil company still exists. Ruby Dowling's estate still owns the oil company of all things.
Really?
Yeah, it's still there. I don't think the checks are as great as they used to be, but it's still there. And the farm ground was all sold or given away, and partly to LTC, part of it was for the prison. So it was Mr. Peace or Ellis's or Grandpa's influence was still there. I mean, it was more than just Heath candy bars as far as Crawford County is related to.
So, getting back to the lineage, LS, he was the founder, is that right?
Of the Heath Company, of the corporation, okay, there was no corporation, it was Heath Brothers, that was later incorporated in 1946, and that's it. And it was incorporated for a couple of purposes. It keeping people there that were going to leave, and making sure that the company at that point was probably better off. He cut all his family. You know, he had L.S. Heath and Sons, Heath Enterprises, the oil company. Everyone was cut into them, and that was and Heath being incorporated in 1946 included a lot of the nephews or the grandchildren that were a part of all that. Some of us got stock as a result of that. And after that, no, the stock, after the original incorporation, there was some stock issued, but very little. But it was only his grandchildren, the great-grandchildren who never issued stock by the Heath Company. If they got stock, it came from their parents. Right.
Okay. So, LS had how many children?
6.
6 children.
6 or 5, depends on how you want to look at it.
Okay.
But 6, that is right now, it is 6. 4 boys, 2 girls.
And their names were?
Well, the oldest was Bayard, B-A-Y-A-R-D, and then Everett, and then Ruby, then Virgil, then Vernon, then Mary.
Okay. And let's see. Which one was your father?
My dad married Mary.
Okay. Mary Heath.
Mary Heath.
Okay. All right.
She was the baby.
She was the baby.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so then they all started having children. And from what I have heard, most of you worked at the plant at some time or another.
Yeah, I think summertime jobs among others, but the 2 boys, of course, the 2 oldest boys, had had founded the confectionery, and they were always there. L.S. Heath provided all that for them. Ruby was, of course, given money, but she married another person in 1939, the same year my parents got married. Ruby was married real late in life.
Okay.
Virgil was kind of taken care of. Stayed with it. He was involved in the Pepsi-Cola when they got a Pepsi-Cola franchise. They also were in the beer distributing business. They were in all different kinds of things. That time frame, I'm not sure about. Vernon did work for the Decatur Herald, but then was coerced to come back. And I mean coerced. They trumped up a bill, he owed him money, and got him back. But he was a journalist by nature and those sort of things. Mary was the little girl, and she stayed that way.
Mm-hmm.
Ruby kind of took care of her. I don't know exactly how that worked totally. Mary's mother was 42 when she had her, but I'm sure that was old then, but I'm not sure there was anything incapacitated about it. But apparently Ruby was the primary mover, because Ruby was 18 or 19 when Mary was born.
Oh, okay.
So Ruby kind of took that role for whatever reason. That is a mystery to some extent.
I see. So are there any stories that you'd like to relate about your years with the family?
Well, let's see. We can go to Mary, which I think is interesting. I knew this when I was a young kid. There was three things that mattered to her. Her dad, the Heath Company, and her sister. The only three things ever mattered to her. And when all three things came to an end, she died. And I had told people for years she won't live any longer than that. And she did. She died 5 weeks after her sister died. So that relationship was real. Okay. Bayard Sr., Everett died very young. That's Dick Heath's dad. Of basically a stroke. I think he was like 51. But he was sort of the wound up kind of guy like Dick Heath was. Interestingly, the story goes, and again, it's kind of interesting that he married, Everett did, a Madeline Shanks, who was Dick's mother and the like. His girlfriend, however, was Joy Steele, who was Miller Williams's later on wife, the guy that from Tulsa, who the Williams companies, who built the big house. And she was going to come back and show Madeline Shanks that she was a big deal, which she was. So there was all that kind of stuff. So I guess Everett, or Skiv as they called him, was sort of cavalier and a promoter type individual. I think he was the sales part of the Heath brothers, the confectionery, those sort of things. Virgil was just there. I mean, I don't think there was anything significant that he did as opposed to Bayard or to Everett. I mean, he was the third brother, and as I said, Vernon was a journalist by nature, and then all came back to the company one way or the other. Ruby married a fellow named Bernard Dowling and lived in Kansas City. He was with GM and then became ill, and LS was able to get Ruby back to town, and they have Bernard was employed at Heath as a result of that. My dad had met my mother in Chicago. I don't know. I just know that's where they met. I know nothing of what the circumstances were. My dad worked for his brother, and he met my mother in Chicago. And then, of course, he went to work for Heath after he married Mary. The rest, pretty much everybody may have had jobs or gone to school, they had grandkids, those sort of things. Bob Heath, I think, may have had another job one time for a brief period of time. That That's Virgil's son. Joyce, Bob's sister, was not associated with the company other than she sold some fundraising and candy back when they were in that business. But I mean, it was sort of a scattered thing. Joan Heath was never, that's Dick's sister, was never, other than stockholder, was never really associated with the company. Her husband was able to sell the company insurance at one point in time. Of course, they later divorced. Pat Kiesling, who was Bayard Heath's daughter, her family were never particularly involved. She lived in California for years. And then, of course, Bayard Heath Jr. was an attorney, was with Heath for a long time. And John Allen Heath were with the Heath Company for a long, long period of time. I was. My brother was not. Bob. And then, of course, no one else at that point in time. That was the end of it. That pretty much is everyone that Robert, Joyce, Dick, Joan, Pat, Bayard, and Alan and John, and Bob and myself were the grandchildren of L.S. Heath. Unless, of course, Ruby was my grandmother, which that would make that different. But as it's publicly known, and as it is right now legally, that's who was there.
Okay. Well, that's all very interesting, and I know that there's been a lot of changes, just like there has in everything in this world. And so the original Heath Company, did it sell out, or?
Well, let's, if you want to get the Heath Company, and really basically I can go to two things. And let's say we get on to, LS died in 55. The Heath Company had all these different businesses. It had beer distributorships, it had Pepsi-Cola bottling franchise, it had dairy, it had the candy, of course. It had all of those things while Mr. Heath was alive. He dies in 55, and oddly enough, I remember I went to the funeral, and at the church, I looked around behind me, James Jones was sitting there. So there was a connection between Jones and L.S. Heath somehow or another. There's some pictures of Jones with a glass wall behind him. He was writing some of his books down at the Heath Company. So there was that relationship. To what extent, I don't know, but it was enough for him to be there, and he was famous at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
But once L.S. died in 55, and his wife had passed away prior to that period of time. Her name was Clara, and she was a fry, and a lot of the fries in the county are related to it. In 50, after that, they started looking. That's when the dairy was sold, and they sold the dairy almost immediately. And of course, Dick Heath, one of the grandkids, was there at that point in time, or not in 55, but yes, he was there in 55. I take that back. He was, because his dad had passed away in 51. So Dick was there and had assumed his dad's ownership position. So he was, and Bob Heath was there in 55 after serving in Korea and working for Owens Corning, I think, who Bob worked for a while. Bayard Heath Jr. was there. Of course, Bayard Heath Sr., Everett was dead. Virgil was still there, and Vernon was there. My dad was there in 55. He had gotten some stock as a result of the incorporation in 46. So that was the family people there. They had a debate, and that turned into a family fight over the Heath ice cream bar. And this occurred in 56 in the attempt to expand that. Otherwise, Heath ice cream, the flavor, that was the beginning, what Heath really was, flavor. And they got in a fight, and Bayard Heath Sr.'s family sold out, which included Pat Kiesling, but not Bayard Heath Jr. Bayard Heath Sr. sold out as a result of this brawl over the Heath ice cream bar. And anytime you have a change, and as I said, Byron Heath Sr. was just the president in 1955. He was 65 years old. So there wasn't really any.
I'm going to have to stop you.
Okay.